So this is Andrew Hollyday, who is a sophomore Feb geology major from Cape Elizabeth, Maine. Teresa of Avila, Mystical Feminism in Early Modern Europe.
Okay, so I'm also going to be talking about Teresa of Avila and sort of her brand of feminism in early modern Europe. And I'm first going to give a short bio, hopefully not too much overlap, first of her childhood, and then as a reformer, and then kind of at the end do a quick temporal comparison, and then and hopefully all along the way be challenging some of the stereotypes around Catholicism or Catholic anti-feminism. Sort of permeates a lot of academic scholarship. And it's also important to recognize that we're going to be applying ideas of modern feminists to historical periods, so just kind of keep that in mind as we go through. So her background, she was born in 1515 to a Converso family. Won't go into too much detail about this because we already did that. But she joins, some scholars suggest that maybe she kind of goes through a somewhat tumultuous adolescence, and some suggest that maybe she entered the convent. The convent that she enters is Nuestra Señora de la Gracia, which is an Augustinian convent initially, and she enters without the intention of becoming a nun. And her father, Don Alonso, is kind of apprehensive of this, but she goes anyway, and then in 1535 changes convents de la Encarnación, which has sort of more mitigated rules. It's here where she really starts to flush out her ideas about her theology. And she notices things like the two-tier system where veils of different colors distinguish class. And she herself comes from a pretty wealthy background, so that's important to keep in mind. And then she falls ill while she's at La Encarnación and goes off to her uncle and is there acquainted with the Devotio Moderna, and from here she gets ideas about solitary prayer, this idea of mental prayer, where you have a really personal relationship with God. And so now, and then sort of this thing happens to her where she starts practicing mental prayer and has what she calls a rapture. And she writes in her autobiography entitled Life, she writes, "I saw his hand, a large golden dart, and at the end of the iron tip there appeared to be a little fire. It seemed that this angel plunged the dart several times into my heart, and that it reached deep within me. When he drew it out, I thought he was carrying off with him the deepest parts of me, and he left all the fire with the great love of God." And so this is sort of the inspiration for the St. Teresa in Ecstasy statue, which is also replica is kept in the Middlebury College Museum of Art that we saw. And so, yeah, that's the inspiration for that. And that sort of marks a transition in her spirituality where she starts to really intensely grapple with questions about her spirituality. So now a quick political, religious context. Ideas of Illuminism and mysticism are starting to kind of spread throughout Southern Europe, and the church takes a more aggressive stance to combat this with the rise of Protestantism. And so, yeah, the church views sort of these expressions of ecstasy largely as female mental instability. And so that is a stigma that she, in some ways, I'm hoping to argue, challenges. And so now just a little bit on her career as sort of reformer of the convent. She, in 1562, founds a convent for women, the Carmel of Jose, and her mission is really to improve sort of the egalitarian mission of the convent, and to make it less classist. She reduces segregation based on class, and as Jonah mentioned, starts the Discalced barefoot Carmelite convents, which really rely on human labor and reduced class, really tries to break apart the class issue. And also tries to integrate conversos more into the convents, and rejects the system of patronage as much as possible. But it's also important to keep in mind the nuances. She does keep some institutions which kind of reinstate or keep the some class problems, such as the two-tier system, which largely stays present in her convents. And then in 1567, she meets Giovanni Battista Rossi, the prior general, and he sort of helps her expand her reach. And so then she kind of goes through a whole range of politics and ends up sort of in a mess of politics where people are repressing her, and ends up back at La Encarnacion as a stationary nun, no longer traveling around establishing new convents, and is kind of subject to different inquisitions. So the inquisitions come up during the political period of the church starting to question people that are possibly heretics. And so, yeah, in 1580, the Pope issues the papal brief Pia Consideratione, which starts to, right before her death, sort of allows the Discalced Carmelites in a separate province in Spain, and clears her from the Toledo Inquisition. And then she dies in 1852, and later is canonized and becomes doctor of the church. So the question here, sort of the central question I'm raising is she or is she not a feminist? We can look at Protestantism and look at all the social progression that happens. We see rejection of celibacy, which leads to less illegitimate children. There's a Calvinist sort of deconstruction of hierarchy and enhanced education. And it's known that literacy rates were higher among Protestant women than Catholic women in the 1500s. So is she, why is she defending Catholicism, which seems maybe to be a misogynist institution? And I think it's important to remember that Calvinist is not a feminist. He, in his commentaries on the Corinthians, chapter 11, writes, "Let the woman be satisfied with her state of subjection, and not take it amiss that she is made inferior before the more distinguished sex." So she's invested in her spirituality, evidenced by her raptures, and so that's pretty clear. And she also understands her political context in that she knows how radical she can be. And she writes in her book of Foundations, "We're living in a world in which we have to think of people's opinions of us if our words are to have any effect." So that kind of summarizes the extent of radicalism she's willing to do. And so, yes, she's defending the church against Protestantism, but she's also very much a feminist. I'm arguing that, and we think that looking back on Annie and Marie's presentations from earlier this semester, they talked about the husband and how in marriage a lot of the power gets yielded to the husband. And so the convent is sort of a system where intellectual honest academic inquiry is sort of preserved, and so she's trying to spread that as much as possible for women. And then she rejects patronage as much as possible, and also deploys a range of rhetorical strategies. She's a prolific writer, writing hundreds of letters in her lifetime. And the first strategy I kind of came across in doing research is the strategy of subordination, and so she sort of tries to self-subordinate, and she's always referring to the authority of others, and then in her strategy of instrumental authority, she references God, and in her autobiography she writes, "Many of the things I write here are not from my own head, but from my heavenly teacher." And so she's referencing God, using him as the authority, not herself. But she's also very much of feminine authority and asserts that. She writes at one point, "Women need no more than what their intelligence is capable of. If they have that, God will grant them his grace. When his majesty is pleased to teach us anything, we shall find that we have learned it without any trouble or labor of our own. So now, lastly, I sort of wanted to raise this question of what is the connection of her of her mysticism specifically with her sort of feminist expression? Is this an expression of feminism? So I wanted to open up to the class and see if anyone had any ideas about what that linkage is. Or we can go into that later too. No one has any ideas. Okay. Anyone have any ideas? I don't really either. I don't know. So I guess we'll end here with a little bit of a temporal comparison. We look back at 1405 at Christine de Pizan, and she writes very sort of self-misogynist, but also probably externally misogynist, or derived externally, statements such as, and I finally decided that God formed a vile creature when he made woman. And I wondered how such a worthy artisan could have deigned to make such an abominable work, which is the refuge and abode of every evil and vice. I detest myself and the entire feminine sex as though we were monstrosities in nature. So this is sort of the obvious transition, progression from 1405. Teresa of Avila is making, sort of represents a vast transition for the feminine cause. And she, through her subtle feminism and recognizing her context and how radical she can be, she deploys a range of rhetorical strategies in her writing, really to advance the female cause.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think we certainly could discuss this question of how her mysticism is connected to her feminism. He's already asked you a question, but any questions for Andrew? Have time for a little back and forth. I was thinking along the lines of it could be a slight pushback against scholasticism, this notion that the Pope interprets scripture and a person should spend many, many years, but she was quite a scholar herself of the scriptures, but they have many, many years of study to get the interpretation that really the Pope controls. It's like this direct line of communication with God, like a really deep personal message directly from God. As a woman, is it pretty bold to say, like, I get this and I deserve this?
Yeah, and she's a big advocate of mental prayer. I think that's a big part of it, that she's advocating within the convent system that people are able to pray in solitude. And so, I think that is related to scholasticism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good. And it'd be great to hear from Marie, Annie, Jacob, all had related presentations. Marie, you had your hand up.
I was just going to comment with the fact that she's so daring about putting it out there that she's had these mystical experiences. Do you think that that's a testament to like the reality or the truth in them? Because I would think it would be kind of like a brave thing to do, to admit, especially in a time when like women were viewed, as you mentioned, as like more mentally unstable or corrupt, and like even as witches sometimes. So I guess like, do you think that there's like, I guess what is her motivation for sharing this? Is it that she wants to like prove herself as a worthy instrument, or?
Yeah, I like that question. I think it's like, this is her honest like experience of the religion, and I don't know enough about this, but I think it's like related to like earlier threads of Christianity. Yes, it was dangerous and there's like a lot of pushback, but I think she's also like has a lot of good like political acumen, knows like how much she can share, and there are accounts of her sort of saying how in her autobiography she writes, I had no one with whom to speak, they were all against me, some it seemed had made fun of me when I spoke of the matter as though I were inventing it. Others said that my experience was clearly from the devil. And so you get some of that. And she goes through that period of like Inquisition and to what she reaches the limit of like how vast her expansion of convents can be. So,
Katie. In a way, I kind of feel like claiming to have the experience, like while it does put her at the risk of seeming hysterical, might actually give her like a little bit more spiritual authority and weight, because just like the Book of Ladies, the earlier thing we read, where she's self-deprecating in such a way and saying, oh, but like God said this to me, and like God and I had this experience together, and I feel like that would give her authority and would make her ideas about like mental prayer and like self like contemplation have more just like justification
Totally.
behind it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so that was sort of, that's related to the strategy of instrumental authority, where she's referencing God as like the originator of her experience. So it's never her like establishing her own authority, it's like using other authority, especially divine authority. Yeah.
I was wondering if there was any mention of like justifying, because like she obviously had this like very personal opportunity to join a convent, but not everyone has like the opportunity to devote that much time. So I was wondering if there's any way that she kind of made it more accessible for like the common person.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think the biggest form of sort of discrimination of the convent is that it is something that is exclusive to wealthy people. And yes, it's also like a time issue, I'm sure, but like one thing she does is try to like deconstruct the issue and barrier for people that are entering convents. So that's like the only thing I can think of, and it should be like sort of making it more accessible, but I don't know, maybe other people know.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, do you know what her opinion would have been of Ignatius of Loyola's college founding movement?
I don't know. Probably, I mean, I think she seems to be like a scholastic, so I would imagine that she would be in support of something like that. Yeah, I think.
I can speak to that in the middle period.
Yeah.
Do you know how her works were viewed by the Catholic Church?
Yeah, so it's kind of a mix. I kind of breezed over the sort of the politics of, but yeah, I mean, she's definitely questioned during the Inquisition, and that's what leads her, like, why she has to go back to La Encarnacion, her first convent, or her second convent, and yeah, I mean, she uses these rhetorical strategies to like establish her authority and sort of maneuver through like the political climate of the Catholic Church not wanting female authority. But yeah, I think it's like sort of a mixture. She's a really prolific letter writer. She writes to King of Spain and is like pretty good at managing the politics, is my sort of reading of it.
And often individuals who are from Jewish ancestry, even though they've converted and it's been a couple generations, they could be targets of the Inquisition. And that's why John de Valdez fled to Italy, because he was of Converso ancestry. So it's a wonder that she didn't get in more trouble than she did.
Yeah.
But that probably is just a certain amount of respect that she got from her intellect and her writings and her popularity among the nuns that she served. And that's another, she gave practical reasons for it. I'm just writing up this prayer advice because people asked me to. So, like, you know, my abbot, they told me to do it, and I'm just writing it as, you know, for the benefit of the other nuns here. So, but you're right to point to her rhetorical strategies. They're really interesting. She's pretty clever.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
And it's interesting because it's like, I don't know, at first I was like a little confused because it seems like my understanding of modern feminism is pretty different than sort of the feminism that she uses in that time period. So that's also interesting.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. All right.